So you remember in the beginning how we talk about having a database, which in our case is going to be MySQL, and we're going to store all of our information in that database. Now, whenever a user comes into the application and log in, they're going to provide their username and their password. So with that information, we have to go all the way back to reach all the way back to the database to grab that information. So with that being said, we will need to have a way to reach back to the actual, information in the actual database. So that means we were gonna need to have some mechanism where we can, maybe write some queries and then fetch the database, say something like, hey, get me this user where the username equals blah blah blah. So that can be a little bit tedious because then in this case we have to write all the queries ourselves, and this is where JPA come into play. Because with JPA, you can actually manipulate a data store, or in this case, the database, without having to write all the queries because JPA is already taking care of this for us. So if we were to take a look at the picture as a whole, so let's say we have a controller, right? And then in that controller, let's say it's the user controller. The user can, send a request to either fetch data or just to log in. So let's take the first example where they would come in and log in, since this is more geared toward the security aspect of it. So when the user comes in to log in, we need to have a service, right? So that service, its goal is to reach out to the backend. So the controller will then reach out to the service. So the service will have to then reach out to the backend, which is the actual database, to grab that user by that username. So instead of doing that ourselves, which is writing all the methods to access the database with all the queries and stuff, which is definitely going to take a long time, we're just going to leverage the JPA repository. And by the way, JPA stands for the Java Persistence API. And it's just an API that is used to manipulate information in a database. So what we have to do, we just have to make sure that our service that we're going to build can leverage the JPA repository, because the JPA repository have access to the database in a very easy way. So we just have to leverage this technology that's already existing, that Spring Data built for us. And then at this point, then the JPA repository can then reach out to the data store and then get the information that we need and then return it to us. So once we have that information out of the database, assuming that the username is correct, and then we can check to see if the password is correct. So once the password is correct, then we can proceed to either give him a token, or if it was a request, then we can just process that request. So we have to build this mechanism where when a request comes from the controller, and then we call a service, and that service is going to leverage the JPA repository to actually, to manage the database for us. So if we need to get some information from the database, if we need to save something, if we need to get a list of all the users or whatever it might be from the database, JPA repository or just the Java Persistent API is going to go ahead and do that for us and then return the information to the service. And from this point on, the service then can then return it to the controller, and the controller can send the response back to the user. So we have to build this picture. And once we have this picture in place, then we will be able to put our configuration for the security, because then when the user is trying to log in, the security configuration will know exactly how to get the user information and then do all the processing from there, which is checking to see if the user provided us with good credentials.